David James was thrown out of a restaurant like garbage simply because he was black. Insulted and humiliated in front of everyone, he left, his rage boiling within him. But the next day, he returned. Not for revenge, but to buy the place and forever change the game. His actions would astonish even the most seasoned observers. But let's go back to the beginning. If this story touched you, please subscribe and like. Together we can fight systemic racism and injustice. David James stood at the entrance of a cozy downtown restaurant where he had often dined after long workdays. This place had always been a peaceful haven where he could enjoy good food and momentarily forget about work. Today, he especially wanted to relax. The project he had been working on for months was finally complete. He entered the restaurant with a light sense of satisfaction and confidence. Inside, the place looked as it always had: dim lighting, soft music, and quiet conversations at the tables. David approached the host station, expecting to be seated as usual. However, instead of the familiar greeting, he was met with a cold look from the manager, a young white man with an arrogant smile. David hadn't seen this manager before, but he wasn't alarmed. Staff turnover was common in such places. "How can I help you?" the manager asked dryly, folding his arms across his chest. David smiled slightly and said, "I'd like a table for one, please." He expected the usual routine, but instead he was met with silence. The manager looked at him with barely concealed disdain before his lips curled into a sarcastic smile. "Sorry, sir, but we don't have any seats for people like you," the manager said with a noticeable sneer. David frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked, feeling a tension start to rise within him. The manager shrugged and turned away as if it were of no importance. "You know exactly what I mean. This place isn't for people like you." The manager's words cut David to the core. He was shocked, but still couldn't believe what was happening. Maybe it was some misunderstanding? He tried to clarify. "I've been here many times and I've never experienced anything like this. I just want to have dinner." But the manager stood his ground. With irritation, he repeated, "Leave or I'll have to call security." The situation was escalating quickly. David realized this wasn't just casual rudeness. It was a direct and blatant act of racism. People in the dining room began whispering, watching the scene unfold. Some customers glared disapprovingly at David. Some snickered, others smirked. David felt a rush of adrenaline. He could have made a scene right then and there, demanded justice, called the police, or unleashed an angry tirade. But he knew that such a reaction would only make things worse and likely lead to further humiliation. Inside him, anger and common sense battled. Taking a deep breath, he decided to leave without giving them the satisfaction of seeing his despair. David turned around and, under the gazes of everyone in the room, walked toward the exit. He felt humiliated and hollow. Thoughts swirled in his head, ranging from anger to sadness. This incident had reminded him of the deep and unjust prejudice he had faced since childhood, despite all his accomplishments. Once outside, he stopped and took a deep breath. The manager's words, "Not for people like you," echoed in his mind. His emotions were overwhelming, but instead of dwelling on them, he began to formulate a plan. He wasn't going to let this incident pass unchallenged. Rather than letting injustice win, he resolved to find a way to turn the situation around entirely. At home, David couldn't calm down. The scene at the restaurant kept playing over and over in his mind. He felt anger, hurt, and disappointment. Despite all his success, all his achievements, he was still judged by the color of his skin. He sat in the kitchen, staring into space, when his wife, Maria, approached him. "Did something happen?" she asked, noticing his quietness. David slowly turned to her, and with a heavy sigh, recounted everything that had happened at the restaurant. He didn't soften the details, describing the manager's harsh words and how he was thrown out in front of everyone. Maria was shocked and outraged. Her face tightened, and anger flashed in her eyes. "This can't go on," she said firmly. "We have to do something. This is unacceptable." David knew his family had always been his support. Maria and their sons, John and Michael, had always stood by him when he faced injustice. They weren't just there for him. They fought alongside him for fairness. John, their eldest, was a successful civil rights lawyer, and Michael worked in business, often dealing with social justice issues in his work. Sitting together at the table, they discussed various options. "We need to take this to court," John suggested. "We have a solid case for a lawsuit. This is clear discrimination." "But what if we make this a community issue?" Michael added. "We could get the media involved, organize protests. That would put public pressure on them to change their policy." However, David felt that these were only partial solutions. A court case could drag on for months, and public pressure might fade as other news stories took its place. He wanted something more decisive, something that would not only address this particular incident, but change the entire approach to such situations. David decided to investigate the restaurant itself. He began gathering information about the establishment's owners, its financial condition, and its history. Soon, he uncovered an important detail. The restaurant, despite its outward success, was actually in serious financial trouble. The owners had been trying to sell the business for several months, but had not yet found a suitable buyer. This was an opportunity. David realized he could not only fight for justice through the system, but also become part of the system to change it from within. He discussed this idea with his family, and while they were initially surprised, they soon agreed with his plan. Buying the restaurant would mean completely changing the rules of the game. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with news of the incident. One of the restaurant's patrons had filmed the scene of David being thrown out and posted it online. The video quickly went viral, gathering thousands of views and comments. People condemned the manager's behavior, expressed support for David, and soon the story made its way to local news. "Look, that's you," Michael said, showing his father the video on his phone. "This is turning into a big deal." The media began covering the story, and David found himself at the center of attention. But instead of building his campaign on scandal and outrage, he chose to remain calm and measured. His goal was deeper: to change the system, not just punish those who had wronged him. The next day, David contacted the restaurant's owners. He made them an offer to buy the establishment, and to his surprise, they quickly agreed. The restaurant's financial situation was so dire that the owners were eager to get rid of it. This was a turning point. David became the owner of the restaurant from which he had been so rudely expelled just a day earlier. He sat in his office, developing a plan to change the business. This place would now become a symbol not just of justice, but of how to overcome discrimination through positive change. The next day, David James returned to the restaurant, but this time his steps were confident and purposeful. Instead of casual attire, he wore a business suit that he typically donned for meetings with business partners. The restaurant was now his. All the documents had been signed, and the establishment was fully under his control. When David entered, several customers were already seated inside. They recognized him from the viral video. Some watched him with interest, others with admiration, but all understood that significant changes were coming to the restaurant. Thomas, the manager who had thrown David out onto the street, noticed him immediately. Thomas's face went pale as he saw David confidently approaching him. He stood at the host station with a forced smile, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Sir, what are you doing back here?" he asked, trying to sound official, but fear was evident in his voice. David stepped closer and, folding his arms across his chest, looked Thomas directly in the eye. "I'm here to remind you that you no longer have the right to throw me out," he said calmly, "because I now own this restaurant." Thomas stood in shock, his face turning red. He tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. At that moment, the entire dining room fell silent. Everyone's attention was focused on the interaction at the host station. "You're fired," David said quietly, not raising his voice. His words were clear and firm. "We don't tolerate discrimination here. If you don't know how to treat people, you don't belong in this place." Thomas looked stunned. He realized this was the end of his career at this restaurant. Without saying a word in response, he quickly took off his apron, tossed it onto the host station, and walked out of the establishment. The people in the dining room watched with surprise, and some even applauded, understanding that David had just changed the rules of the game. But for David, this was more than just firing one person. It was a step toward a deeper transformation. After Thomas left, David turned to the room and addressed the assembled guests. "Today begins a new chapter in this restaurant's history," he began. "This place will no longer be a symbol of prejudice and injustice. I intend to make it a space where everyone is respected and valued, regardless of the color of their skin, gender, or background." His words were met with approval from those in the restaurant. Some started clapping, others shouted words of support. David felt that he had taken the first important step in proving that positive change was possible, even where prejudice had once reigned. Afterward, David got down to business. He began meeting with the staff to discuss how the restaurant's operations could be improved. Many of them were pleased that change had finally come, especially after the departure of Thomas, who had been known for his unfair management methods. David also reached out to the local community, inviting people from diverse cultures and backgrounds to help transform the restaurant into a truly inclusive space. He invited racial justice groups to use the restaurant as a venue for meetings and events. The restaurant became not just a place to eat, but a platform for discussing important social issues. People who had once felt uncomfortable in such establishments began coming here, knowing they would be treated with respect. The restaurant's new policy quickly spread through social media. The video of Thomas's firing became another viral hit, but this time the response was much more positive. People saw it not just as punishment for racism, but as a sign that change was possible. The restaurant became popular, attracting more and more patrons who wanted to support David and his vision of justice. David knew this was only the beginning. Changing public perception would take time, but he was ready for it. His restaurant had now become a symbol of the fight for equality and justice, an example that real change was possible, even in the most ordinary of places. Several months passed since David had acquired the restaurant, and the changes were visible to everyone. The establishment became a meeting place for people of all races, ages, and cultures. A once exclusive and elitist venue had been transformed into a symbol of inclusivity and fairness. The restaurant's interior was redesigned, with its walls adorned with artwork by local artists representing diverse cultures and perspectives. The menu now featured dishes from different countries, further enhancing the sense of unity and respect for various traditions. David didn't stop there. He actively involved local community organizations that worked on racial equality, hosting charity dinners and events whose proceeds went towards supporting educational programs for disadvantaged youth. The restaurant became not just a place for food, but a space for learning and inspiration. Each week, the restaurant held open discussions, lectures, and seminars featuring activists and community leaders. They addressed issues of racial discrimination, social inequality, and paths to justice. These weren't just talks. People shared experiences, told their stories, and found support among one another. The restaurant became an informal hub for the fight for equality. One day, during one of these events, David noticed a familiar face among the attendees. It was Thomas, the very manager he had fired on his first day as the restaurant's owner. Thomas stood in a corner of the room, clearly nervous and unsure of what to do. David froze for a moment, then approached him. "Thomas," David said calmly, trying not to sound judgmental. Thomas nodded awkwardly, looking down at the floor. "I wanted to talk," he began hesitantly. "After that day, a lot has changed. I realized I was wrong. I understood that my behavior wasn't just a mistake, but the result of what I had been taught and what I saw around me all my life. I want to apologize to you, David, and I want to change my life." David listened intently. There was genuine remorse in Thomas's words. He was a man who had faced the consequences of his actions and was now seeking a path to redemption. "Change doesn't happen overnight," David replied softly. "But anyone can start somewhere. If you're truly willing to change your life, I'm ready to help you. We always have room here for those who want to work on themselves and make the world a better place." Thomas was stunned. He hadn't expected such a response. He thought he would be judged or rejected, but instead David offered him a chance. From that moment on, Thomas began attending the events and seminars held at the restaurant, learning and gradually shifting his views. After some time, David even offered him a job again, but this time in a different role, as a community relations manager. Thomas agreed and began actively participating in organizing charitable events and working with local activists. His personal transformation became a clear example that change is possible if a person is willing to learn and grow. Soon the restaurant became known not only in its city but beyond. The media actively covered the story, not as a scandal, but as an example of how racial prejudice could be overcome and something greater could be created. David was invited to interviews, asked to share his experience, and explain how he had managed to turn an incident of discrimination into a platform for positive change. The culmination of this success came when the restaurant received a local award for its contribution to community development and the fight against discrimination. David stood on stage accepting the award, feeling immense pride not just for himself, but for everyone who had helped him along the way, his family, his staff, and the people who believed in his vision. "This award isn't just mine," David said in his acceptance speech. "It belongs to everyone who believes that change is possible. It's proof that justice and equality can prevail if we all work together." His words were met with loud applause. David's restaurant had become a symbol not just of his personal victory, but of the victory of the entire community. It was a reminder that systemic injustice could be overcome through unity, understanding, and a commitment to a better future.